For decades, we've thought of Germany as Europe's economic rock. Always prudent, always disciplined, just unshakable. But what happens when that rock starts to crack? Well, Berlin is doing something nobody ever saw coming. They're making a massive, incredibly risky gamble to save themselves. So let's get into it. Germany's unprecedented half-trillion-euro bet.
Look, this is a total break from everything Germany has stood for. And the scale, it's just staggering. We are talking about a 500 billion euro bet. To put that in perspective, that's the largest spending package in the country's entire modern history. It's a mind-boggling 15% of their GDP.
And that brings us to the big question, right? The one we're really digging into here. Why on earth would a country that's famous for its fiscal discipline, a country that never spends more than it earns, suddenly make the riskiest bet in its history? Well, the answer? It shows some really deep cracks in the foundation of Europe's powerhouse.
Okay, so to really get a handle on this gamble, we need to go back. We have to understand the unique economic machine that powered Germany for decades and, why it finally broke down.
So at its heart, Germany's model was pretty simple, but boy, was it effective. You see, while other big economies were shifting over to services, Germany did the opposite. They doubled down on manufacturing. They built stuff, great cars, chemicals, incredible machinery, and they just sold it all to the rest of the world. And their dependence on this model, it's just astounding. I mean, exports make up nearly half of Germany's entire GDP. That is 3 times the share of the US. This constant river of cash flowing in from other countries fueled the entire system. It kept the government's pockets full without them ever having to borrow a dime.
But, and this is a big but, there was a catch. The model's greatest strength was also its biggest weakness. The entire economic machine depended on one thing: other countries buying their stuff. If the world ever decided to stop buying German products, poof, the whole system would just collapse.
Now, you'd think they'd try to reduce that risk, right? Nope. Germany doubled down on who they were. In 2009, they literally wrote their fiscal discipline into the constitution. They created something called the debt brake. And this law made it pretty much impossible for the government to borrow any serious money, even to stimulate the economy in a crisis.
And when you compare their philosophy to other countries, wow, it's stark. Germany legally capped its new borrowing at just 0.35% of GDP. Meanwhile, the United States regularly borrows over 5%. So the German government basically tied its own hands, betting that this incredible stability was the only thing that mattered.
And you know what? For a decade, it worked like a charm. The German economy seemed totally unbreakable. But then, 2020 hit. And a series of shocks, one after another, delivered this brutal 1-2 punch that just shattered the whole model.
So first you had COVID, which brought global trade to a dead stop.
That just gutted Germany's export-heavy economy. Then, just as things were starting to look up, Russia's invasion of Ukraine cut off the cheap energy that their factories desperately needed. And boom, the country was thrown into a deep recession that, honestly, it still hasn't climbed out of. That energy shock was just brutal. Think about it. Before the war, more than half of Germany's natural gas came from Russia. Within a few weeks, that supply just vanished. It collapsed by 90%. So electricity costs went through the roof, and factories had to literally shut their doors because they couldn't afford to keep the lights on. The impact on real people was devastating. The economy shrank by over $200 billion. Unemployment shot past 3 million people for the first time in decades. The unbreakable machine was broken. Okay, so normally when a rich country hits a recession, what does it do? It spends its way out. That's exactly what the US did during COVID. So why didn't Germany do that? Because the one tool they needed most, government spending, was legally locked in a box thanks to their own debt brake. So with their backs completely against the wall, no other moves left to make, the German government did the unthinkable. They took their most sacred economic rule, ripped it up, and announced a radical plan to reboot the entire engine. And this is where that €500 billion comes into play. So where's it all going? Well, the biggest piece of the pie, $300 billion, is for a massive infrastructure overhaul. Another $100 billion is going into a fund for climate and energy transformation. And the rest, that's going to support all those industries that are really struggling. And look, these aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. We're talking about real, concrete projects. Things like expanding high-speed rail to make the country more productive, fixing thousands of crumbling bridges, and building massive new wind and solar farms to make sure they're never held hostage over their energy supply again. The whole idea here is pretty straightforward. They want to pump a huge amount of cash into the economy right now in the short term to kickstart that machine again. The hope is that this creates over 1 million new jobs and generates enough long-term growth that they can actually pay off all this debt down the line. Okay, so on paper, that makes a lot of sense, right? But here's the thing. This isn't just about Germany. This gamble, it has enormous implications. And if it goes wrong, it could put the entire European economy at risk. So why is this so incredibly risky for everyone else in Europe? Well, you have to remember Germany's unofficial job title. For decades, it's been the lender of last resort. It's the rock-solid financial backstop that props up weaker economies like Italy or Spain or Greece whenever there's a crisis. Honestly, the entire Eurozone is held together by this one simple belief among investors. They're willing to lend money to countries like Italy or Greece, not because they have total faith in Rome or Athens, but because they assume that if things go really wrong, Berlin will step in and fix it. That trust, it's the glue holding the whole thing together. But that leads to a pretty terrifying question, doesn't it? The whole system only works as long as Germany itself is the unshakable rock. But if Germany, the ultimate backstop, gets into financial trouble, who bails them out? The answer is simple. Nobody. And we're already seeing the first warning lights flashing. The financial markets, they're getting nervous. You know the interest rates the German government has to pay to borrow money? They're called bond yields. Well, they've already shot up to a 40-year high. That's a huge signal that investors are starting to second-guess Germany's famous stability, and it makes it way more expensive for the country to borrow. So what we're watching here in real time is a complete teardown and rebuilding of the German and, by extension, the European economic model. And the stakes couldn't be higher. If this works, it could save a continent from stagnation. But if it fails, it could trigger higher inflation, massive job losses, and instability all across Europe. This is the ultimate high-stakes bet, one that could make or break the entire European project. And right now, nobody knows which way it's going to go.